Grant Hayes stepped off the bus, his worn-out boots scuffing against the uneven cobblestones. For the first time in years, he breathed in a world far removed from the glitz of New York City. Here, in Charleston's historic district, the golden rays of the setting sun painted the streets in a soft, nostalgic glow. The air was rich with the sense of jasmine and salt water, promising him the fresh start he so desperately needed. Back in New York, he wasn't Grant Hayes. He was Graham Hartley, the heir to the Hartley Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar empire. Boardrooms echoed his name, charity galas spotlighted him, and the public expected him to be perfect. But beneath the tailored suits and polished smiles was a man suffocating under the weight of expectations, hollow relationships, and a father who demanded more than perfection. Back in New York, he was built different than Hart. Grant ran a hand through his dark hair and adjusted the strap of his satchel, a modest bag he'd picked up at a thrift store to blend in. Everything about his appearance was calculated. The rugged clothes, the simple demeanor. He wasn't Graham here. He was just a man seeking authenticity, yearning to be valued for more than his last name. Magnolia House stood in all its historic glory. Its sprawling gardens framed the estate, while ivy-clad walls and towering oaks whispered secrets of a bygone era. The house would serve as his sanctuary, a place to disappear from the relentless scrutiny of his old life. Inside, the air was cool, faintly scented with lavender and aged wood. At the reception desk, an elderly woman with glasses perched on her nose greeted him briskly. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "Yes," Grant replied, shifting his satchel. He had to get used to this name, to fully embrace the role he was playing. She handed him a clipboard. "You'll be reporting to Miss Evans. She oversees the preservation projects here. Your duties will include garden maintenance and assisting with restoration efforts." Grant nodded, signing his name in careful, slightly altered handwriting. Each stroke of the pen felt like severing a tie to his past. The woman pointed him toward the East Wing library. "Miss Evans should be there. You'll like her. She's passionate about this place." The word passionate resonated with him. In New York, passion was often tied to profit and power. Here, he hoped it meant something real. The library's dim lighting and towering shelves of books wrapped the room in a cocoon of quiet. At the far end, a slim woman with auburn hair, pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, stood engrossed in a dusty manuscript. Her focus was magnetic, her hazel eyes scanning the pages with an intensity that hinted at a deep connection to the history she was preserving. "Miss Evans?" Grant said softly, not wanting to disturb her. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and guarded professionalism. "Yes, that's me." "And you are?" "Grant Hayes," he replied, holding her gaze. "The new groundskeeper." A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she recovered quickly. "Ah, welcome. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow, but it's good you're here. The gardens need attention, and we're short-staffed for the event this weekend." "What event?" Grant asked, genuinely curious. Clara Evans set the manuscript aside and crossed her arms. "A fundraiser to save Magnolia House. The Landry Corporation is trying to buy out the surrounding district for a luxury shopping complex. They're framing it as modernization, but it's just an excuse to tear down history for profit." Her words stirred something in Grant. He'd grown up surrounded by people like the Landrys, who only valued what could be monetized. Clara's conviction, her willingness to fight, struck a chord. "How can I help?" he asked. She studied him for a moment, her brows lifting slightly in surprise at his eagerness. "We'll need help setting up the gardens and preparing for the event. But first, let's see if you can handle the basics." She gestured toward the door. "Follow me." As they walked through the gardens, Clara's voice softened, becoming almost contemplative. "Magnolia House isn't just a museum, it's part of Charleston's soul. Families have memories here. Weddings, reunions, even goodbyes. Losing it would be like tearing out a piece of the city. Her words lingered in the air, mixing with the hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves. Grant nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Sounds like a fight worth having. She stopped and turned to him, her expression serious. It is, but it's not just about the house. It's about people like the Landrys, who think money gives them the right to rewrite history. As they worked in the gardens, Clara watched him closely. Despite his unassuming demeanor, his skill with the plants betrayed experience. You've done this before, she observed. Grant shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. You could say I've had practice. I won't put you in jail. Her laugh was light, almost musical. Well, it shows. Maybe you'll stick around long enough to teach me a thing or two. Grant didn't respond. He wasn't sure how long he could keep up the charade, but for now, he wanted to stay, not just for the paycheck or anonymity, but for reasons he couldn't quite articulate. Grant laughed a little. That night, as he lay on the creaky bed in his rented room above a coffee shop, he thought of Clara. She was genuine in a way he hadn't encountered in years. But she deserved honesty, and he wasn't ready to give her that yet. Across town, Tessa Landry strode into her father's sleek office, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. Tossing a folder onto his desk, she smirked. The fundraiser at Magnolia House is this weekend. We're attending. I gotta go. Her father barely looked up from his papers. Why? It's a small-time charity. Tessa's lips curled into a predatory smile. Because I want to see how they squirm before we crush them. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Do what you want, Tessa. But don't let your games derail the deal. She turned on her heel, her determination sharpening. If there was one thing Tessa Landry hated, it was losing. And she wasn't about to let Magnolia House, or anyone associated with it, stand in her way. The next morning, as the soft glow of sunrise filtered through the oak trees, Grant knelt by the flower beds of Magnolia House. He adjusted his gloves, his hands working the soil with careful precision. The rhythmic sound of birdsong filled the air, broken only by Clara's cheerful voice. Good morning, Grant, she called, carrying a stack of flyers in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Her auburn hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, but loose strands framed her face, giving her an approachable, almost disarming look. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. Morning, Clara. Hard at work already? She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Always, but we need every bit of help we can get for this fundraiser. Grant scanned the flyer she handed him. It featured a picture of Magnolia House in its glory days. I can help distribute these after I'm done here, he offered. Clara tilted her head, studying him. You're full of surprises, aren't you? First gardening skills, now volunteering as a publicist? He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Just trying to pull my weight. That afternoon, as Grant worked on a section of the garden overrun with weeds, Clara approached him with a distracted look on her face. She carried an old leather-bound book under her arm, her brows furrowed as though deep in thought. Be your opinion, she said, hesitating slightly. Grant wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against the rake. On gardening? I'm flattered. Clara smirked, shaking her head. No, not gardening. History. She held up the book. This belonged to the original owners of Magnolia House. It's a ledger, but I think there's more to it than meets the eye. Intrigued, Grant gestured for her to sit on the stone bench nearby. What do you mean? She flipped open the book, her fingers brushing over the faded ink. There are gaps in the records, entries that don't make sense. It's as though someone erased parts of the story, but look at this. She pointed to a series of entries dated in the 1800s. These transactions reference a hidden parcel. If I'm reading this right, the Landrys might not have a legal claim to this property after all. Grant leaned closer, the scent of jasmine mingling with the musty smell of old paper. You're saying this land might not belong to the current owners? Yes, Clara nodded, her excitement building. Exactly. If we can find proof, it could be the key to saving Magnolia House. But the missing pieces... She sighed, closing the book. I don't even know where to start looking. Grant studied her for a moment, impressed by her determination. Maybe the answers are in the house. Have you checked the attic? Clara shook her head. Not yet. It's been sealed off for years. The structural integrity isn't great, and it's not exactly safe. I'll help, Grant offered without hesitation. We can take a look together. Andy waved. Clara hesitated, her gaze lingering on him. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted, his voice firm. Besides, it sounds like an adventure. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but she nodded. All right. Tomorrow, after the morning preparations, we'll check it out. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grant wandered the quiet streets of Charleston. He found himself drawn to a small cafe with a rustic charm, its windows glowing with soft light. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a corner booth, his thoughts drifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was on to something big. The idea of uncovering a mystery hidden within the walls of Magnolia House excited him in a way he hadn't felt in years. But he also knew that getting involved meant risking exposure. If anyone recognized him as Graham Hartley, everything would unravel. Across the room, a man in a tailored suit caught his eye. He was speaking on the phone, his voice low and urgent. Something about him felt familiar, and it took Grant a moment to place him. Logan Landry, the younger brother of Tessa. Grant's stomach tightened. What was he doing here? Logan ended the call and stood, glancing around the cafe. Grant turned his face away, hoping to avoid recognition. But as Logan exited, Grant caught a fragment of his conversation with the barista. Call Tessa, I'll be back before the fundraiser, she knows the plan. Grant's jaw clenched. The Landrys weren't just attending the fundraiser, they were planning something. He needed to warn Clara. The next morning, Clara and Grant stood at the base of the attic stairs, armed with flashlights and a crowbar. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they ascended, dust particles dancing in the beams of sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls. The attic was a time capsule of forgotten relics, stacks of yellowed newspapers, trunks filled with moth-eaten clothes, and an assortment of furniture lay scattered across the space. Clara's eyes lit up as she scanned the room, her historian's instincts kicking in. This is incredible, she murmured, running her fingers over an antique rocking chair. So much history just left to decay. Grant moved to a stack of crates in the corner, prying one open with the crowbar. Inside, he found a collection of documents tied with frayed ribbon. Hey, Clara, take a look at this. Baiswani moved into the room. She joined him, her breath catching as she examined the papers. These are deeds. Some of them date back to the early 1800s. If we can cross-reference these with the ledger, we might be able to piece together the missing history. As they sifted through the documents, a chill ran down Grant's spine. Something about the room felt off, as though they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, but the attic was empty. Shaking off the unease, he focused on the task at hand. After an hour of searching, Clara unearthed a small locked box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Her hands trembled with anticipation as she tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Looks like we'll need a key, she said, her frustration evident. Grant took the box from her, examining it closely. Or a locksmith. Let's take it downstairs and see what we can do. As they descended the stairs, the distant sound of voices reached them. Clara frowned, quickening her pace. In the main hall, they found Tessa Landry speaking with the receptionist, her tone saccharine but laced with menace. We're just here to confirm the guest list, Tessa said, her smile not reaching her eyes. I'd hate for there to be any, mishaps. Vera stepped forward, her posture stiff. Miss Landry, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting you until the fundraiser. Tessa's gaze flicked to Clara, then to Grant. Recognition flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. I wanted to ensure everything is in order. After all, We wouldn't want anything to jeopardize your precious Magnolia house." Brant groaned and opened his eyes. Honestly, he was pretty sure he could spot any pathogens running away. Grant's fists clenched at her condescending tone, but he forced himself to stay calm. Clara, however, wasn't one to back down. Magnolia House will be fine, Miss Landry," she said evenly, "but thank you for your concern." Tessa's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see." As she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on Grant. "And who might you be?" she asked, feigning curiosity. Grant Hayes," he replied, his tone clipped. "Just the groundskeeper." Tessa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more as she walked out. Once she was gone, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She's up to something," she muttered. Grant nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to find out." That night, as Grant lay awake in his room, the locked box sat on the table beside him. His mind raced with questions. What secrets did the box hold? And how far were the Landrys willing to go to claim Magnolia House? A sudden noise outside his window drew his attention. Peering through the curtains, he spotted a figure moving in the shadows. His heart pounded as he grabbed a flashlight and slipped outside. The garden was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel under his boots. He scanned the area, but the figure was gone. In its place, he found a single slip of paper pinned to the oak tree. The note read, "Stay out of it. This isn't your fight." Grant's grip tightened around the paper, his resolve hardening. Whoever was trying to intimidate him didn't realize one thing. He wasn't the kind of man to back down. The morning sun filtered through the thick canopy of oaks, casting dappled light over the grounds of Magnolia House. Grant stood by the flower beds, the lingering tension from the mysterious note gnawing at him. His gloved hands worked methodically, pulling weeds and turning soil, but his mind was elsewhere. The warning pinned to the oak tree played on a loop in his thoughts. Stay out of it. This isn't your fight. Who had left it, and more importantly, why? Clara approached from the main house, her auburn hair glinting in the sunlight. She held the locked box under one arm and a clipboard in the other. "Morning, Grant," she said, her voice chipper despite the shadows under her eyes. Clearly, the previous day's discoveries had kept her up late too. "Morning," he replied, forcing a smile. "Any luck with the box?" She shook her head, her frustration evident. "I tried every key I could find in the archives, but none of them fit. This thing is like Fort Knox." Grant straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "We'll figure it out." "Did you notice anything else unusual? Like someone hanging around the grounds last night?" Clara frowned, her hazel eyes narrowing. "No, why? Did something happen?" He hesitated, debating whether to tell her about the note. Ultimately, he decided against it, for now. Clara already had enough on her plate with the fundraiser looming. "Nothing important," he said, brushing off her concern. "Probably just my imagination." Clara didn't look convinced, but she let it slide. "Well, if you're free this afternoon, I'd like your help going through the rest of the attic. There's still so much we haven't uncovered, and if the Landrys are planning something, we need all the ammunition we can get." Grant nodded. "I'll be there." Across town, in the sleek offices of Landry Enterprises, Tessa Landry stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the Charleston skyline. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her crossed arms as Logan entered the room. "You're late," she said without turning. Logan rolled his eyes and dropped into a leather chair. "Traffic," he said dismissively. "What's the big deal?" "The big deal," Tessa said, spinning to face him, "is that we're running out of time. The fundraiser is in 2 days, and Clara Evans is more stubborn than I anticipated. We need leverage." Logan smirked. "Relax, Tess. We've got the city council in our pocket, and Dad's lawyers are already drawing up the acquisition contracts. Magnolia House is as good as ours." Tessa's eyes narrowed. "Don't underestimate her. People like Clara fight harder when they're backed into a corner. And then there's the new guy, Grant Hayes. Something about him feels off. Specifically, he kind of looks the same as the dude from the photo shoot. Oh. Logan raised an eyebrow. The groundskeeper? What, do you think he's some secret agent sent to sabotage us? I don't know, Tessa admitted, her voice sharp, but I'm going to find out. Later that afternoon, Grant joined Clara in the attic, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of mothballs. They worked in companionable silence, sifting through crates and trunks filled with relics of the past. Clara's excitement was palpable as she unearthed faded photographs, handwritten letters, and other artifacts that spoke to the rich history of Magnolia House. This place is a gold mine, she said, holding up a black and white photo of a wedding party from the 1920s. Every piece tells a story. Grant couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. You're passionate about this, aren't you? She glanced at him, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I guess I am. It's just places like Magnolia House are disappearing. If we lose this, we lose a part of who we are. Her words resonated with him more than she could know. He thought of his life in New York, the cold, sterile world of boardrooms and billionaires. Magnolia House felt like the opposite of everything he'd left behind, a place where authenticity still mattered. As they worked, Grant noticed a strange pattern emerging in the documents they uncovered. Many of the letters referenced a hidden treasure tied to the original owners. At first, he dismissed it as a romanticized notion, but the sheer volume of references was hard to ignore. Clara, he said, holding up a yellowed letter. Have you seen this before? She leaned over, her eyes scanning the page. This handwriting matches the ledger, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. It's another clue, but what kind of treasure could they be talking about? Do you think the Rock City lobbyists have hidden gems here? She asked. Grant shrugged. Maybe it's metaphorical, or maybe it's something the Landrys don't want us to find. Clara bit her lip, her mind racing. If we can prove there's something of historical value here, it could stop the sale entirely. The council wouldn't dare let the Landrys demolish the house. Grant's stomach tightened at the mention of the Landrys. He still hadn't told Clara about seeing Logan at the cafe, or the note. For now, he decided to keep that to himself. Clara didn't need another reason to worry. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grant found himself wandering the grounds, the locked box tucked under his arm. The mystery of its contents gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were close. His steps took him to the old tool shed, its weathered wood and rusted hinges a testament to its age. Inside, he found a small workbench littered with tools. Among them was a set of old lockpicks, left behind by some long-forgotten handyman. Grant hesitated. Picking the lock felt like crossing a line, but his curiosity won out. He carefully manipulated the picks, the tumblers clicking into place one by one. Finally, the lock gave way with a satisfying pop. Inside the box was a collection of items, a tarnished gold locket, a bundle of faded letters, and a small, intricately carved wooden key. Grant's breath caught as he examined the key. It didn't match any of the locks in Magnolia House that he was aware of, but it had to mean something. Tucking the items back into the box, he resolved to show Clara in the morning. Whatever the key unlocked, he had a feeling it was the missing piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, Logan Landry nursed a whiskey, his expression thoughtful. Across from him sat a man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. A private investigator. You sure about this? Logan asked, sliding an envelope of cash across the table. The investigator nodded. Grant Hayes isn't who he says he is. I ran his description through a few databases and came up with a match. Graham Hartley, heir to the Hartley Foundation. Logan's lips curled into a smug smile. I knew it. So, what's he doing here, playing gardener? The investigator shrugged. Couldn't tell you. But if you want me to dig deeper, no, Logan interrupted, standing and slipping on his jacket. This is all I need. Let's see how Mr. Hartley handles a little pressure. The next day, as Clara and Grant prepared for the fundraiser, tension crackled in the air. Guests would begin arriving in a few hours, and everything had to be perfect. But as Grant helped set up tables in the garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. His fears were confirmed when Logan Landry strolled onto the property, his presence as unwelcome as a storm cloud. He made a beeline for Grant, a predatory smile on his face. "Nice to see you again, Graham," Logan said, his voice low enough that only Grant could hear. Grant's blood ran cold. "I think you've got the wrong guy," he said, keeping his tone steady. He thought. Logan's smile widened. "Sure I do, but don't worry. I won't blow your cover, as long as you stay out of my way." Grant's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "Just to remind you that this isn't your fight," Logan said, echoing the words of the note. "Keep that in mind, or things could get complicated." Logan walked away, Grant's hands curled into fists. He glanced toward Clara, who was busy greeting volunteers. She deserved to know the truth about him, about the Landrys, about everything. But with the fundraiser about to begin, he wasn't sure if now was the right time. One thing was certain, the battle for Magnolia House was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised. The morning of the fundraiser began with a flurry of activity. Volunteers bustled through the gardens, setting up tables and arranging centerpieces, while the scent of fresh-cut flowers wafted through the air. Clara directed the efforts with an air of calm determination, but beneath her composed exterior, Grant could see the strain. Her movements were sharp, her voice clipped as she instructed the team. Magnolia House's future hinged on today, and the weight of it was pressing down on her. Grant worked silently alongside her, hauling crates of supplies and helping hang strings of twinkling lights in the oak trees. Every now and then, their eyes met, and Claire would offer a small, grateful smile. But the moment was always fleeting, interrupted by another task or a demanding volunteer. As the sun climbed higher, the gardens transformed into a scene straight out of a southern fairy tale. White linen tablecloths fluttered in the breeze, and antique silverware gleamed in the sunlight. The magnolia trees stood like sentinels, their blossoms lending an air of timeless elegance. Guests would arrive soon, and the stakes had never felt higher. Grant took a moment to step back and survey the scene. His gaze drifted to Clara, who was now consulting with a caterer near the main house. She was a force to be reckoned with, her auburn hair catching the light as she gestured animatedly. He admired her tenacity, her unrelenting drive to preserve something meaningful. But he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of foreboding that had settled in his chest since Logan's visit, and in everything. "Grant," Clara called, snapping him out of his thoughts. She approached him, her clipboard tucked under one arm. "Can you help me check the sound system? The band's arriving soon, and I want to make sure everything's working." Yeah. I already took care of 4. Those are stolen," he replied shortly. In all of these?" "Of course," he said, falling into step beside her. As they walked, Clara glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" Grant hesitated, weighing his words carefully. He wanted to tell her the truth about Logan, about his real identity, about everything. But the timing felt wrong. The fundraiser was too important, and he didn't want to distract her with his own problems. "I'm fine," he said finally, just focused on making sure today goes smoothly. Clara studied him for a moment, her hazel eyes searching his face for answers. But if she suspected he was holding something back, she didn't press the issue. Instead, she offered him a small, reassuring smile. "Thanks for all your help. I couldn't have done this without you." Grant's chest tightened at her words. He didn't deserve her gratitude, not when he was keeping so many secrets. But he nodded anyway, hoping she couldn't see the guilt lurking behind his eyes. By early afternoon, the guests began to arrive. The gardens filled with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Ladies in pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats strolled arm in arm, while men in tailored suits exchanged handshakes and pleasantries. The air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease, as though everyone present understood the stakes of the event. Grant moved through the crowd, doing his best to blend in. He exchanged polite nods and answered questions about the gardens, but his focus remained on Clara. She was everywhere at once, greeting guests, overseeing the catering, and ensuring every detail was perfect. Her energy was infectious, and for a moment, Grant allowed himself to believe that they might actually pull this off. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Logan Landry. The man was leaning casually against a table, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes scanning the crowd like a predator searching for prey. Grant's jaw tightened as their gazes met. Logan raised his glass in a mock salute, a smug smile playing on his lips. Grant's instincts screamed at him to confront Logan, to put an end to whatever game he was playing. But before he could act, a burst of laughter drew his attention to the main stage, where Clara was stepping up to the microphone. Something was wrong with him. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and confident, "thank you for joining us today. Magnolia House is more than just a historic landmark. It's a symbol of our community's resilience and a testament to the stories that have shaped us. Your support means the world, and together, we can ensure that this treasure remains standing for generations to come." The crowd erupted into applause, and Grant felt a surge of pride. Clara was a natural leader, her passion shining through in every word. But as she continued her speech, he noticed Logan weaving through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the stage. A sinking feeling settled in Grant's stomach. Whatever Logan was planning, it couldn't be good. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Grant kept a close eye on Logan, who seemed to be biding his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, Clara moved through the crowd like a whirlwind, her determination unwavering. But even she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of unease that had begun to ripple through the event. It wasn't until the auction began that the first cracks appeared. Clara had arranged for several rare artifacts from Magnolia House to be auctioned off, with all proceeds going toward the preservation fund. The items included antique furniture, vintage photographs, and a set of silver candlesticks, rumored to have belonged to the original owners. The bidding started strong, with guests eagerly vying for the chance to own a piece of history. But as the auction progressed, a hush fell over the crowd. Logan had stepped up to the microphone, his charming smile masking the venom beneath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "before we continue, I feel compelled to share some information that may influence your decision to bid." Clara's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening as she stepped forward. "Mr. Landry, this is highly inappropriate." "On the contrary, Miss Evans," Logan interrupted, his tone dripping with faux sincerity, "I believe the guests have a right to know the full story." He turned to the crowd, his expression grave. "As you may know, my family has been in discussions with the city council regarding the future of this property. While Magnolia House is undoubtedly a beautiful piece of history, the financial realities of maintaining it are daunting. My father and I have proposed a solution that would preserve the spirit of this site while modernizing it for future generations." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Clara's face flushed with anger. "Your solution involves demolishing the house and replacing it with a shopping complex," she said, her voice rising. "Your wanted was immediately heard." "And what did you say?" Logan raised his hands in mock surrender. Now, let's not get emotional. Change is never easy, but it's often necessary. And I think we can all agree that progress is..." "Enough!" Grant said, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, his expression hard as steel. This isn't about progress. It's about greed. Logan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. And who are you to lecture me about greed? He sneered. A humble groundskeeper? Grant's heart pounded as the moment of truth loomed before him. He could feel Clara's eyes on him, her confusion and hurt like a weight pressing down on his chest. But he couldn't stay silent any longer. My name isn't Grant Hayes, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging within him. It's Graham Hartley. I came here to escape a life I didn't want, but I can't stand by and watch you destroy something this important. The crowd erupted into whispers, and Clara's face paled. But before she could respond, Logan's smile turned predatory. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. The prodigal son of the Hartley Foundation, slumming it as a gardener. How, quaint. Grant ignored him, his gaze fixed on Clara. I should have told you the truth from the beginning, he said, his voice softening. But everything I've done here, everything I've felt, it's real. And I won't let the Landrys take this place without a fight. Clara stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, there's another must-see video on screen now. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss out on more incredible content.